All right. How's everybody doing today? So it's a little bit weird to be standing up in front of a bunch of people without 6 inches in front of your face, right? So this morning I wanted to sort of touch on a couple of things, not just it says web intelligence, HANA, and row-level security, but also wanted to touch on kind of a new feature, or at least an unused feature, or not commonly used feature within business objects. It always seems like every once in a while you run across a feature in business objects and you're like, I wonder what that does. So we'll touch on that as we get a little bit deeper into this. So how many of you guys are doing data level or row level security today within business objects? Just show of hands. That's it? Your users get to see everything? Come on, don't give me that. So how many of you guys are using universes today? Pretty much everybody, right? Okay. So the old way of doing this, or I'll call it the normal way of doing this, is using the data security profiles, or you're using at user or BO user, right, in your filters and your queries to filter out data for specific individuals, or maybe based on a specific group or whatever. As cBEYOND kind of shifted into the HANA world for reporting, where we're not going through a universe, we're actually going off calculation views. So those are they're similar to database views, but have a separate engine behind them, and they're geared for high performance analytics. So we're not leveraging a universe to be able to allow for those kind of functionality. So we're directly reporting off the calculation views, and we had to do row level security a little bit different within SAP HANA. Let's see. So in this, so there's no universe layer, and we leverage something in business objects called the data source reference connection. Does anybody know what that is? Has anybody seen that? Nobody? Okay, has anybody seen the user profile screen in business objects? Couple of you? Okay. Well, in the middle of the screen, before you get to the authentication types at the bottom, there's this little area that I think everybody kind of blows past. Says, it's nothing that I can worry about. But there's something called the data source reference connection. And what that allows us to do is actually specify a database user ID and a password for that particular user that we can leverage for reporting at a connection level. Okay. All right. Sorry, I'm gonna step up here like a player. So we're looking at the architecture for this kind of solution, and we run across a couple of different pieces here. So on the BobJ side, we've got this data source reference, which ties in with the universe connection, or just a connection. Everybody's familiar with that, right? We need to set up a database connection for our universes. Obviously the BO user, right? That's important, user. And then the web intelligence report, right? So we need to be able to see the data. You guys still hear me? Then off center here? Okay. All right. So I can walk and talk at the same time. All right. Oh, okay. All right. So on the database side of this architecture, we've got obviously a database user, right, for connecting into the database and getting access to the objects. We have a calculation view, which is our query that's we're going to use for reporting. Underneath that calculation view, we have maybe a combination of tables or views that make up the underlying query for the calculation view. And then we have something called an analytic privilege. And that really comes into where the row level security kind of logic resides, as it were. All right. So that's kind of the building blocks that we're going to walk through here. All right. So in business objects, in the CMC, if you look around, and I think it's on the, if I remember correctly, it's on the middle column and it's at the bottom of the list, but there's something that says data source references. If you go in there, it doesn't look superly impressive, right? You just add an item, that's about it, right? You're adding to this list. And what this allows you to do is it now shows up underneath the user, all right? And Patrick, you're going to keep me straight here, right? So if I say anything wrong, call me out. All right. So as we look at the business objects user screen, again, as you start to scroll down in about the middle of the screen or at the bottom of the screen in terms of the slide here, here's a list of the database references. So in there, you notice a user ID, a password, confirmation password, but on the left is a name. All right. So that connection name or that reference name we can leverage. All right. Right. Any questions so far? All right. I got you on my edge of the seats, right? Yep. Yep. So you. Yeah. So one shows up there by default. It's if you don't use it, no harm, no foul. This one, I specifically created a specific connection called RL test or RL underscore test. And what I did was for my user account, I set it up to be part of the Southeast sales group. And that's part of the kind of example that I'll walk through. All right. Now we can set it up for multiple users. We can set up that reference. So all the users go in as that particular user, or you can mix and match. So one of the things I'll show at the end is how do you take this to the kind of the next level? What we're walking through today is kind of the building blocks, but my thought here is once you understand the basics, you know, you can take it to the next level based on your business, based on your requirements, et cetera. Okay. Does that answer your question? So all this is, yes. So we'll use that connection for connecting to the HANA database. So let's see. All right. So the key here is when we get down to the connection, so this should look familiar, right? When you're setting up a database connection in business objects. The key here is at the very top of the connection, usually it's just user ID and password. But in this scenario, we're going to leverage the business objects credential mapping. And what that credential mapping is it ties directly back to that database reference. All right. So underneath that, you see that data source reference. Well, that's tying back to the user level, and it's going to pull the user ID and password back from the user level within the CMC. Are you following me? All right. So it's a way to kind of connect the dots, right? Versus usually in here, we just have a user ID and a password and everybody uses that connection information, right? This allows us to now kind of tap into the user level and dynamically pull that database connection information as we run through this. Okay. All right. And then below that is the normal kind of, you know, host information, port and instance, et cetera. Okay. All right. So I touched on a little bit of this. So database user within HANA, we need an account to be able to log on to the database. That's obviously important. The database and views are just the normal kind of database objects, right? You see that in SQL Server, Oracle, et cetera. The calculation views are a little different. And those are the advanced data slicing views that will make up or is made up of views or tables from the database. And then lastly, the analytical privileges, which allow us to fine grain the row level security when accessing the data. So it might be as simple as filtering on a state. It may be filtering on an organization, et cetera. Whatever, you know, everybody's security is a little bit different. It's up to you how to implement it. All right. So what I wanted to do is just going to make this a little more real. Here's some of the data that we're going to be using as part of our example. So we have a table out there called sales group security, and nothing fancy here, right? So it's just saying, hey, these two groups, and they're associated with a set of states. So Southeast sales group should see North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And the Northeast sales group should see Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont. All right. And then we've got some sales order data of blue and red widgets, right? That's a normal thing you want to see. And then we have states associated with that data, right? So pretty simple kind of concept here where we're going to say, hey, for a particular sales group, we want to see, based on the state, what sales order they should see. Okay. Any questions? Pretty straightforward, right? Nothing super high tech here. All right. So within HANA Studio, or the HANA essentially database interface, we were set up a really simple calculation view. It's essentially going directly against the sales order table and just returning all the columns. All right. Nice and simple, nothing super fancy there. All right. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road, as they say, the analytic privilege. So we're going to start out with something fairly small now. If you notice in the left-hand side, what we've done is we picked the calculation view. So what privilege we want to associate with the calculation view. And then on the right-hand side, we've picked, well, we can go in and essentially pick what column we want to use to filter our data, right? So I had mentioned utilizing state as that. So I pick state in here. And at the very bottom, if everybody can see this, it has, what I've done is I've done a fixed value. So I've set the state to Georgia, if I remember correctly from yesterday. So essentially this application, or sorry, analytic privilege is going to filter our data for the state of Georgia. Nothing super fancy there, right? So now the last piece of the puzzle to sort of bring it all together is now associating that analytical view, or sorry, analytical privilege to the user account. So we've got a user account out there called Southeast Sales Group, right? Which is tied to my business objects user, right? Back in the CMC. And we've sort of made that connection, right? So if I log in, or if I run a Webby report that's based on the calculation view that's logging in using that account, what data should I see? Anybody? Anybody? Dave, come on, help me out here. Oh. So yes, Georgia, there you go. All right. Am I, oh, okay. All right. So we should only see the state of Georgia sales data or sales order data. Okay. All right. So you're like, well, you know, if we got to do all 50 states, you know, that's going to be a lot of analytical privileges going on here, right? That's going to be a lot of work, job security, which is a good thing, but still going to be a lot of work setting that up and then maintaining it and associating it with users, et cetera, right? So there's got to be a better way. There is. So we've seen it kind of at an individual state level, hard coded, but it works. All right. The next step is I can create a small procedure that goes out and it looks at who I am. So it says, if you look at kind of the bottom, you can read the SQL here, but it says select state from GovERDS, which is just a schema name, sales group security table. So that was just our table of security group or sales group names, and then the list of states that they could see, right? And in here, we're going to say where group name is equal to session user. And essentially all a session user returns is the currently logged in user within HANA, right? So if I'm logging into the database as SE sales group behind the scenes, right? It should return the 4 states associated with that sales group from that table, okay? Great. So what do I do with that now, Keith? Well, great question. So now if we look in the bottom right-hand corner, instead of doing a hard-coded state of Georgia in there, we're seeing there's a calculation, or it says, let's see, catalog procedure in, all right? So it's just saying, call a procedure from the catalog, from the database catalog, and look at the values that come back from that particular procedure that we just created in an in statement, right? So it allows multiple values to come back and filter against that. Okay. Still with me? All right. So now, and I just had to bring back up the data from the table again, just to, you know, keep us on track here. So for the Southeast sales group, we had it associated with North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. All right. So now if you look at the bottom where I'm actually querying, I'm logged in as the Southeast sales group. And that is the data that we're seeing returned from the sales order table. Okay. So now we've shown you how to filter either for an individual state, hard coded, or doing something dynamic, leveraging a stored procedure to return a data set as part of our filtering mapping. And again, this is the basics, right? You can take this a lot of different directions, but this is the basics to get you guys started. All right. All right. And now full circle. Now we're back to the business objects webby interface, right? So I'm now looking at my web intelligence report that's based on that calculation view. And I'm seeing that the data filtered based on who I'm logging in to the database via the, anybody want to, what was the original object we were looking at in the CMC? Oh.
The RL account that you created.
So within the user account, within security. The CMC, there's, what was that called? There was the database.
The connection, the data reference connection.
There you go. So that all kind of full loop all the way from starting out within the CMC. Thank you very much. The in the CMC where we've defined what account a user is mapped to, all right, down to the calculation view, applying an analytical privilege for security, and then back to business objects within web intelligence or the reporting layer and seeing that filtered data. Okay. So where do we go from here? So obviously we can extend the logic here. This was very simple. We showed a dynamic one for state and a hard coded one for state. Everybody's security, scenarios are different. So it's really taken this kind of basic and taking it to the next level. The other piece to this too is within business objects and HANA, that allows, you can actually set up HANA SSO. So for every user, right, within business objects, you can have it single sign on into the database. So instead of where Wiiisdom set it up more at a group level, we can actually set it up at an individual user level. So you could have logic in there that says, hey, Keith Johnson can only see the sales order from Vermont. That's it. That's all he gets access to, right? So it becomes a little bit easier kind of setup than setting up all those user accounts in the CMC. All right. And in here, I've included a couple URL links to the documentation. If you want to dig further into this in terms of data source references, analytic privileges, the single sign-on, and what's required as part of that kind of setup. So, and with that, any questions? And I think I did okay on time, right?
What's the best practice or standard to do this database reference connection for a lot of users? Is there a easy way?
So that's a really good question. So we've just started, full disclosure, we've started utilizing it probably over the last year or so, and still trying to get what I'll call it, the best practices kind of in place with that. I will say there's a fine line between moving from the database reference setup and doing the straight single sign-on where you can really take that granularity down. So I think it's you've got to kind of make a decision as to what level of security do you want to take that down with. And I'll plug in for 360. You've got capability in 360 to set that information up as well if you're using the 360 tools. So there's options instead of having to touch every single user. There's ways to just kind of automate that process to upload that information. So
thank you.
Welcome. All right. So Patrick, I filled in for you for a little bit. Now you got to steal the show.
Last question. Go ahead. Yeah, one more. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just to piggyback on that same note, SAP HANA, I mean, has inbuilt roles and privileges, right? So there you showed an example of using the sales group for filtering and controlling the user access to show a particular view. But why not use the inbuilt feature of roles and privileges in SAP itself? And how do we club that? And if that's the I think the basis for that question of how do we is there like a standard way to utilize and leverage what is already existing?
So roll that back a little bit. So you were talking about leveraging
SAP's roles and privileges, PFCG, kind of, where we don't have to necessarily control on a state level, but on how a user ID is defined in the system.
right.
And the roles and privileges of a user ID itself will dictate how and what that particular user can view and cannot view.
So you're talking about more on the SAP ECC side.
Security side,
On the
HANA security side. That's all. I mean, that's okay. I mean, there may be. That's why I was very curious on: is there a standard baseline configuration way of That's a really good question, though. By the way.
yeah.
Thank you.
Versus the HANA built-in security is what he's asking, and then what you're showing is the one that you created from the scratch, how to implement the security within the business object as a role label instead of using the user universe, utilizing the BO user in universe.
So, and the reason we did that is we're going directly against the calculation views and not leveraging the universe layer at all.
Right, right.
So that's kind of the differentiator there is we needed to go back to the analytical privileges associated with a calculation view or associated with a user and a calculation view to do that kind of row level security that usually in the normal when you're doing like SQL Server or Oracle, et cetera, you're leveraging the universes to do that kind of equivalent security filtering mechanism. Correct.